The file was not meant to be opened. Its edges were singed from a long-ago fire in a ministry basement, its cover warped by water, its pages fused together like bone. Across the front, written in thick black strokes, were two words that survived everything that tried to erase them. Most secret. Underneath, another inscription in a clerk's tidy hand. Bruneval Operation, Radar Retrieval, February 27, 1942. Authorized eyes only. The first page held only one line. A mission that had no right to succeed. And then the story begins. The year was 1942. The Second World War had descended into its darkest phase for Britain. Europe lay under German control. The Luftwaffe hammered British cities night after night. U-boats prowled the Atlantic, suffocating supply lines. And in the Thames estuary and the low-lit control rooms of Fighter Command, a quiet desperation gnawed at the edges of Allied defense. Because something had changed. British radar stations, lifelines of the Battle of Britain, were suddenly less effective at tracking German bombers. The blips appeared later. The readings were less precise. Something had enhanced Germany's detection capability, allowing their bombers to penetrate deeper, hit harder, and vanish faster. British scientists knew a new German radar system existed. They had intercepted signals, sharp, clean, disturbingly efficient pulses. But they didn't know how it worked. They needed to see it, touch it, dissect it. They needed to capture a piece of the apparatus itself. That machine was the Würzburg radar, the Reich's most advanced short-range tracking system, compact, precise, and deadly in the hands of a trained operator. It improved anti-aircraft accuracy. It guided night fighters toward British bombers. It helped shape the Luftwaffe's evolving air doctrine. And there was one at Bruneval, perched on a cliffside inside occupied France. The British High Command studied reconnaissance photos, a spherical dish, a narrow access road, barracks nearby, a garrison of German Air Force technicians, anti-aircraft guns positioned on the cliffs. No one wanted to admit it out loud, but in briefing rooms the thought lingered. It is impossible. A direct strike would destroy the equipment. An undercover mission would require months behind enemy lines. A naval raid would trigger coastal defenses. A bombing attempt would annihilate the radar but reveal nothing. There was only one option left. Drop paratroopers directly onto the headland, seize the radar under fire, tear it apart with their hands, capture its operator, hold off German counterattacks, and escape by sea. An idea so reckless that even Winston Churchill initially raised an eyebrow. But the man tasked to make it reality, Lord Louis Mountbatten, head of Combined Operations, did not blink. He wrote in his operational diary, "High risk, high value. The Luftwaffe must be blinded." The plan became Operation Biting. The assault force was chosen from C Company, 2nd Parachute Battalion, men who had jumped fewer than a dozen times in training, yet were about to execute the most complex airborne raid Britain had ever attempted. Their commander, Major John Frost, unflappable, precise, and committed to an almost mathematical calm under fire. His men trusted him with their lives. They would later follow him to Arnhem, to the bridge that bore his name, but Bruneval was their first crucible. The paratroopers trained in absolute secrecy. No one knew where they were going. No one knew what they were stealing. They practiced storming mock buildings. They rehearsed tearing equipment apart. They learned to silence sentries with blades and bare hands. They timed every task down to the second. And in an underground laboratory in Malvern, British scientists built wooden replicas of the Würzburg radar based on fuzzy reconnaissance photos. They guessed how the casing opened. They guessed how the screws were placed. They guessed what cables carried the signal. But they didn't know. They wouldn't know until the raid began. The Royal Navy prepared landing craft under strict blackout. The RAF readied Halifax bombers for a low-altitude drop. Coastal radar stations tracked the channel weather. Agents inside France monitored German patrol routes. The operation required 5 moving parts to synchronize with perfection. A misstep in any one would doom the mission, and the Germans would not hesitate to annihilate the raiders. The night of February 27, 1942 arrived with a thin cloud layer and a stiff wind sweeping across the English coast. The paratroopers loaded into their aircraft with faces darkened to avoid reflections. They carried Sten guns, grenades, wire cutters, demolition charges, spare socks, and in some cases pocket knives sharpened to surgical points. The Halifax engines roared to life. The runway lights flickered once. The planes lifted, and Britain held its breath. Over the channel, darkness swallowed their formation. The planes flew low to avoid detection. The pilots used dead reckoning, not radio, to prevent German intercepts. Major Frost peered through a slit window. Far below, faint white surf crashed against the French cliffs. They were close. Then came the green light. The jumpmaster shouted above the roar, "Go!" The paratroopers stepped out into nothingness. Wind tore at their smocks. Chutes deployed with violent snaps. Frost landed hard, rolling through the frozen grass. Around him, silhouettes dropped silently from the sky. An airborne storm descending on a coastline the Germans believed secure. The landing was imperfect. The wind pushed some men off course. A few landed in pits, others tangled in trees, but the unit regrouped with remarkable speed. German sentries on the cliff heard the parachutes but hesitated, unsure if it was wind or a trick of the sea. That hesitation would cost them everything. Frost assembled his sections. He raised his hand, and C Company charged the radar station. The first shots cracked across the field, sharp, controlled bursts from Sten guns. A German sentry cried out. Another sprinted for the barracks but fell before he could sound the alarm. Frost's men sprinted toward the spherical radar dish, its metal surface gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Inside the operations hut, the radar operator threw up his hands in shock as British soldiers burst through the door. They grabbed him, gagged him, and shoved him outside. He was valuable, more valuable than metal. A German technician who understood every dial of the Würzburg could reveal everything British scientists needed to know. Meanwhile, the technical detachment, men hand-picked for their calm under pressure, launched themselves at the radar. They hacked open panels, ripped out components, and unscrewed control mechanisms. One soldier held a flashlight between his teeth. Another used a crowbar to force open a stubborn casing. A third pulled out the radar's main dipole antenna with both hands, its metal spar scraping against frozen steel. Every clang risked detection, every spark risked death. They worked anyway. To their credit, they removed the critical components in 12 minutes, a feat British scientists later called physically impossible except under wartime adrenaline. The Germans were awake now. Machine gun fire erupted from the barracks down the slope. Bullets ripped through the grass. Frost's perimeter men returned fire. A fierce firefight broke out across the ridge. The paratroopers had the dish, but they needed the escape corridor, the beach, where Royal Navy landing craft were due to arrive. But there was a problem. Between Frost's men and the sea lay a German strongpoint equipped with heavy machine guns. And that strongpoint was awake. Tracer rounds carved red arcs across the cliffs. German flares burst overhead, turning night into a cruel spotlight. The paratroopers hugged the earth, returning fire in short, disciplined bursts. They advanced by yards, then by inches, then by crawling through mud and brush. One of Frost's sergeants, a wiry man named Haynes, sprinted forward under fire, hurling a grenade through the embrasure of the strongpoint. The blast shook the cliffside. Men cheered. Frost shouted the order, "Forward!" The paratroopers surged. The strong point fell silent. The path to the evacuation beach opened. But the Germans were not finished. Reinforcements moved from the south, a truckload of infantry who had been closer than intelligence predicted. They dismounted fast. They opened fire. The paratroopers were pinned again. Frost ordered his men to hold while the radar components were carried toward the shore. The Navy had arrived. 3 landing craft, engines growling, nosed onto the beach under moon-silver surf. The paratroopers ran for them. German bullets snapped overhead. A British sailor yelled, "Move! Move!" Water splashed. Men fell. Others carried them. Bodies were dragged across pebbles and thrown into boats. Frost was among the last to reach the surf. He fired until his Sten clicked empty, then waded backward into the waves as German rifle flashes chased him. Moments later, the landing craft pulled back from shore, churning water white, leaving the cliffs behind. The Germans arrived too late. The British were gone. The sea had swallowed them. The radar components were hustled onto trucks, then onto aircraft, then into secret laboratories across Britain. Scientists tore them apart within hours of arrival. What they found changed the air war. They learned the frequency. They learned the beam pattern. They understood the scanning mechanism, they discovered weaknesses, and they developed jamming countermeasures that would later confuse German night fighters and blind anti-aircraft guns during critical operations, including the bombing of the Ruhr and the Normandy invasion. The stolen Würzburg radar gave the Allies the power to disrupt German detection for the rest of the war. One scientist wrote, awestruck, in a private note, "The raid has bought us years of advantage. Years." In Berlin, the Luftwaffe launched an investigation. They couldn't fathom how paratroopers had reached the site, how they had known what to take, how they had escaped. They assumed an entire battalion, maybe more, had attacked Bruneval. In truth, fewer than 120 men had carried out the operation. Back in Britain, C Company received quiet praise. Major Frost, though deeply proud of his men, downplayed his role in post-raid interviews. "We just did our part," he said. But the classified reports told a different story. They emphasized leadership steady under fire, discipline exceptional, extraction flawless under impossible conditions. The Bruneval raid became the blueprint for later airborne operations and joint raids combining paratroopers, commandos, scientists, and naval extraction. It was a mission stitched together with courage, precision, science, luck, and a refusal to accept that impossibility was final. Today, when historians speak of turning points in the technological war against the Luftwaffe, they mention the Bruneval raid with reverent clarity. It proved that the Allies could strike deep into Europe, steal the Reich's most guarded secrets, and vanish before dawn. It proved that the paratroopers were not just shock troops but instruments of intelligence warfare. And it proved that even the most advanced machine in Hitler's arsenal could be undone by a handful of cold, tired men with knives, wire cutters, and the will to run toward enemy fire. This is the story of the paratroopers who dropped into occupied France, tore a secret radar apart under fire, and flew its stolen technology home in the night. A mission that all logic said should have failed in minutes, but instead reshaped the entire air war over Europe.